Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. All right, hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of American Medieval. I am excited because today we are joined by Dr. Hannah Weaver. Hannah is an assistant professor of medieval literature at Columbia University. She's the author of a wide variety of articles, and her book, Experimental Histories, Interpolation, and the Medieval British Past, came out in 2024 with Cornell University Press. And she is a co-host of the podcast Proust Curious in partnership with Public Books. Welcome to the podcast, Hannah.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so delighted to be podcasting because it's been a minute since I did it, and I love it. It's really, and I was just delighted that you started this podcast, Matt, because I feel like you're the perfect person to do it.
Oh, well, thank you. And you're a veteran at this because you said it's been a minute since I did it. And that is just perfect kind of cadence and rhyme, which is exactly what we're looking for.
That's why you get the English professors in, right?
That's right. That's right. Because us simple historians, we just basically name off names and dates and stuff like that. And it gets really boring after a while, honestly. It's more fun to talk about text. So
listen, I know that your podcast has a cursus all its own. I'm ready to detect the hidden rhythms.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, there's subtle undercurrents. I mean, it's like, this is basically my podcast is like the Mediterranean. Brodel was really kind of talking about me rather than anything else. So anyway, we are delighted to be here. As listeners know, we do, however, like to start off with perhaps a silly question. So I hope you'll indulge me my silly question before we kind of talk about lots of other interesting medieval stuff. And because our silly question involves time machines. And maybe you're the same as me. My experience, somebody inevitably will ask you if you were, study anything about the past, somebody will ask you about time machines at some point. But our question is a little bit different in that let's imagine for a moment that we have a time machine, but that time machine is single use. And I should say there and back, so you don't have to stay anywhere. You get to come back. But it is single use. And the caveat on this, the only way that it can be used is that it has been presented to you, Hannah, and you have to go back and tell a younger version of yourself, a young Hannah Weaver, that they will someday grow up to be a medievalist. How does young Hannah react to that news?
I think young Hannah would be perhaps a little surprised, but not displeased. Okay. It's totally not a surprise that I grew up to be a college professor. Like, that was very predictable. Even though I don't even know it was a stated dream, it just makes perfect sense that I would end up teaching and that I would end up teaching literature. All of that makes sense. Okay. I think the Middle Ages was a real sort of left turn that happened for me in college. So my young self might not have known. Although, in retrospect, of course, I can be like, I was always reading T.H. White, which is true.
Okay.
And so perhaps it was more predictable than it felt. But it certainly was not something that I was constantly obsessed with or puzzling over. Yeah. I, in fact, had a very weak education in history for reasons that have to do with me having gone to a very idiosyncratic high school. And so I don't think I even took a world history class that covered the Middle Ages. Like, for me, it was just purely this side of fantasy and like Arthuriana that I enjoyed reading, but didn't think was a topic of study, really.
Mm-hmm. I got to say, I mean, high schools, like I went to a big public high school in New York, and like we got like almost like a drive-by view of the Middle Ages in like AP World History, as it was called, in which there was this ancient stuff, which was cool. And then there was some bad stuff, and then Renaissance, Reformation, and then the rest of the semester. So.
And then the Crusades.
Yes. With a deep, bellowy voice. So.
Yes, yeah.
But you had a sense, from a young age that you wanted to be kind of a college professor, a teacher, or something of that nature.
I guess.
But there was an interest in the Middle Ages that came later.
Yeah.
So where was it kind of along your undergraduate journey that you got pulled in? And I ask this because for many of the people that I ask this question, it's very similar, right? Like you encounter a course or a teacher and they just kind of change you. They open you up to that, hey, this stuff is neat. This stuff is interesting and you can study it and you could do stuff with it and it's really cool and you should do it.
Yeah. I had the perfect storm. And it actually begins with Proust, embarrassingly.
Okay.
If you'll indulge me.
Proust is never embarrassing.
This story is embarrassing.
Because I always pronounce it correctly.
Just wait. So I'm 18 years old. I'm an undergraduate. I'm first year undergraduate.
Okay.
And essentially because my cooler friend was doing it, I decided that I would read Proust. Age 18 is the perfect age.
Okay.
But I hadn't ever studied French at all. And so I was obviously reading it in translation. And as I was reading it, I was like, oh, how could I encounter this great work in translation? I must learn French so that I can read Proust in French.
Yeah.
Which is like humiliatingly, I think I've told this story more than once publicly. But at any rate, I then started taking French classes. And of course, being the sort of person who overpromises and overdelivers, I then was like, I must do my junior year abroad in France. But no, I can't do something where I'm still learning French. I need to go and just enroll at the University of Paris. Like, obviously, that's my only choice.
Yeah.
And so in this sort of like intense flurry of trying to do, I think it was 8 semesters of French within a year and a half, I ended up taking the survey class taught by our friend and colleague, Uri Kleiman. And it was just because it was the one that fit into my schedule. But she's a medievalist at Boston University. And the survey was not supposed to touch on the Middle Ages, getting back to your point about it being minimized. But because that's her area of expertise, she added Marie de France to the syllabus. And I was just fascinated. And then the next year I was in Paris. So I basically took nothing but medieval courses the next year because it was the perfect timing. And there were so many offered. I was taking art history classes, and then a bunch of literature classes. And so I was really able to, like, the second my interest was sparked, I was able to kind of do this deep dive.
Yeah.
And then when it came time to apply for graduate school, it was definitely the area that I was best prepared in. And so it kind of, even though I had other interests, I wasn't a plausible candidate in those other fields. So
yeah. I can sympathize because, you know, I haven't told this story kind of on the podcast, but I was absolutely bullied into studying, like reading classics kind of in high school, early college by like one of my best friends as well.
Yeah.
Which was, he was just like, we hung out all the time and we watch movies and do like young boy stuff and things like that. But then he would be like, so Matt, what are you reading? What novels are you reading? I'd be like, I'm reading like comic books and like stuff like that. And he's like, you know, I just finished Theodore Dreiser's, you know, American Tragedy. It's just like, what the hell are you talking about, man? And he's just like, it's so cool. God bless you, John Borgoy, wherever you are. But actually, like, and then I kind of at one point like picked up one of those, and I was just like, oh wow, this is actually pretty great. And so I can kind of sympathize with that.
Yeah.
Second, Marie de France is a gateway drug, isn't she?
Gateway drug, totally.
She is amazing.
Yes.
I teach that. I make sure, like, shout out to Irit, who will, in a general survey, decides like, there's no medieval in this? Screw that. There's medieval in this course now. Yeah, like we're just going to do that. But also, I always do the same thing with my medieval survey that I teach here at Virginia Tech. Is like Marie de France is like a centerpiece of that. Is that these kids read the lays and they are going to get something out of them, and we're going to talk about all the weird and interesting and funny ways.
Yeah.
And like 75% of the students here like react the same way like you did, like I did, you know, when I first encountered Marie. It's just like, wow, this is weird and neat and interesting. And it's so unexpected that there's women in the Middle Ages, because most people don't talk about that.
Right.
You know, but that they can have these kind of fantastical, really interesting, you know, stories that are so complicated and deal with themes that seem very relevant to a bunch of 18 to 22-year-olds sometimes.
Yes. And one of the great, you know, circle of life moments happened to me this year, which is that's a text that's now on the syllabus of our core curriculum here at Columbia.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So I teach it now in the core, and I also teach it in my survey class, much like you do. And this year I was the person who presents to the instructors of that course about the text in order to give them ideas of what they could do in the classroom. And I was just like, wow, it's like really, this is it's all come to fruition. Like now the student has become no one can master Marie de France. Is very complicated. But actually that was the thesis of my presentation was students, I think at least for us, it's a first year course. And we were just coming off of like Augustine's Confessions and Ibn Arabi's super oblique, like interesting quasi-mystical poetry. And then they hit Marie de France and they're like, this is a fairy tale. This isn't anything. Like, in other words, coming right after texts that are truly difficult to understand, almost sentence to sentence, or at least parts of them are.
Sure,
to get to Marie de France, which seems clear as a bell, and then realize that, like, the whole point was you need to make them realize that it's actually just as complicated as those things they were just reading, right? Like, they can understand each sentence, but make them think about the depth beneath like a story like Guigemard, which I'd be happy to explain to your listeners, but we don't need to go there either.
Let's talk about Guigemard. This is a Marie de France podcast now, so that's totally fine.
I mean, why not?
Why not? Yeah.
But for those who haven't read Marie de France since they were first years in college, or who maybe need to go pick up their copy now after our recording,
absolutely,
this is the story of a young knight who is the son of a noble family. And the thing about him is that he wants no part of love.
No part.
His family criticizes him, but he's just like, not for me is love. He goes on a hunt with a bunch of his bros in the woods and ends up wounding and ultimately killing a white hind who has, weirdly, a hind is a female deer, but has the horns of a male deer, of a stag. And also, weirdly, the arrow rebounds off the forehead of this animal and wounds him in the thigh.
It does.
And this animal, this like androgynous animal, curses him and is like, your thigh wound will never heal unless you find true love. He goes on a magical boat that's self-steering and finds this woman who's sort of the classic mal mariée, the badly married woman who has a jealous husband who's confined her to this sort of like building adjacent to the coast, but she can't go inland. He lands there. Obviously, they fall in love. There's a really interesting side character, which is her servant, which I'm not going to get into. But then ultimately they're discovered. They must separate. This is the one instance I know of in medieval literature of a chastity belt.
Indeed.
So he girds her with a chastity belt. She knots his shirt in this really complicated way. They're ultimately reunited with this really bizarre scene of recognition where at one point Guigemard is like, is it her? Women look very much alike. How can I know?
Yes.
She's being courted by this other guy that Guigemard, who was his ally, politically speaking, kills. And then the story ends.
Yeah.
And so this is like kind of an intense recap, but what I try to get students to realize is this whole like love problem. Like they tend to be like, like a fairy tale love story. The knight finds his lady and they end up together. Like I think that's the haphazard reading that anyone might have if they're not really paying attention to what's going on in the story.
Yeah.
The problem is that like a nobleman's son who wants no part of love, like that's a political problem. That's a succession problem. It's destabilizing for his territory. And because it means he won't produce an heir. And there will be like, there's very likely to be turmoil if that's what happens. And the fact that the woman he ultimately falls in love with is in fact married to someone else means that even should they produce issue, that initial political situation is not resolved because any issue will be illegitimate. Then he's also destroyed an alliance by killing his ally, basically over this woman. So he's like fractured the kingdom and hasn't solved any of the political problems with which the story begins. So this quote unquote happy love story is politically not so happy. And then there's the issue of like, why isn't he interested in love? Like, why does he have this encounter with this like sort of queer figure of this deer? The things like women look very much alike. Is Guigemard just a hetero dude who happens to be like perhaps like demisexual, just to use a bunch of like, contemporary vocabulary. Or is this actually like a tragedy in that he's been sort of forced by this curse to betray his like real sexual preferences? In other words, is the reunited lovers scene actually like a horrible, tragic climax rather than a triumphant reunion?
It's such a great story, and it's so interesting because it deals, like you were saying, with all these really interesting themes which are lurking just kind of, which a 12th century audience or, a 13th century audience would absolutely kind of get. But, in the 21st century, especially students are not kind of equipped to that. And that's why we're there, right? In the classroom. This is kind of value-added education as opposed to, AI, for example. Just something off the top of my head.
Well, and they're raised on Disney, right? They're raised on the lovers being reunited is automatically the aim. It's the telos and the happy telos of many a Disney tale.
Yeah, the happily ever after, right? And this superficially seems to conform to that. But I was thinking about that as you were describing it, the scene of recognition at the very end. And, we should say obviously, spoiler alert, which I probably should have said at the beginning, but
I mean, it's okay.
The thing's been around for 900 plus years, so I think we're
and
good.
It's 10 pages long. It's fine.
Yeah, so it's fine. But that scene of recognition too, it's he has that kind of thing where it's well, I don't know if it's really you, even though you're wearing the chastity belt that I specifically gave you and is unique kind of in the world. And even though you have just untied the chastity belt that you have given me, are you really her? Mm-hmm. So is that actually a failure of recognition? Or as you were saying, is that reticence, to actually do that? The dude's already gone to war for her, right? But he's still not sure that it is.
Well, not quite yet. He's there. He's actually there to help the guy who's holding her captive.
Yes.
And then once he figures out that he has this rival and they've had their reunion, then he's no, I'm turning against you. He has this treasonous moment.
Yes. And then ends up allying with the guy who's actually, they've been fighting against this whole time. So
exactly.
So the political alliances are totally fractured and everything is kind of thrown up in the air there.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I'm just staring at your book, Oathbreakers, over the corner. But we have a video, dear listeners, and I can see Matt and his books. But I'm just
I'm just living in a tower of books. That's all it is. Right. Yeah. No, but there's so much there that within the context of what we know about Marie and what we know about kind of how her tales are told, this stuff is really important, right? And which would be really resonant, especially if she were kind of associated with the court of Henry II. Political alliances are very important issue, and succession very much at the top of mind of everybody kind of involved in everything at that time.
Very live conversation.
Very live conversations. So Marie de France kind of seemed to be coming back to kind of the original question, right? So Marie de France seemed to be kind of your transition, and then you had an experience kind of in France of just kind of immersing yourself in French literature. But I have to ask too, and I kind of know the answer to this, so I apologize in advance, but I don't think our listeners might, but you wound up in a Department of English.
I did.
And you're teaching a text that is, we're talking about a text, for example, that is primarily written in French. How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I think Marie de France is a perfect case study to make this vivid to our listeners because we've just spent some time explaining her. So even if you didn't previously know who she is, hopefully you have a little bit of an idea.
Yeah.
But essentially, so my PhD is also in French, but all along I have been, or at least in my graduate work, I've been very interested in what is often called the French of England or Anglo-Norman French. So it's the use of the French language outside of the territory we now call France, which looks like a hexagon, right? So in the Middle Ages, for one thing, that national boundary did not pertain, the national if we're going to even use the word nation, but the political territories and boundaries were constantly shifting across this incredibly long period that we study. So it's a highly unstable situation. But also, after the Norman conquest of 1066, French became the dominant vernacular in England for centuries. It was still used for administrative purposes until the 15th century. And so a lot of the earliest texts in French that are more than just a note in a margin, but extended narratives in French actually come from England. Mm-hmm. So one of the earliest ones is a text in octosyllabic rhymed couplets by a guy called Benedate, who's translating a Latin text about the voyage of St. Brendan, another totally wild and perplexing text with basically a monk on a boat, as this would be the log line. But at any rate, this precocious text is written in England. The earliest vernacular histories are written in French, but in England. Mm-hmm. And so even though I initially especially studied texts that were written in French, politically speaking, or in terms of the national department divisions that we use in the American university,
sure,
my work could actually, I think in many ways fits better in an English department. And my department is actually English and comparative literature. And here at Columbia, we take that and very seriously because at the end of the day, any medievalist worth their salt is a comparatist to some degree.
Yeah.
Because so many of the categories that we like to use now do not pertain to our period. Nowadays, I work on texts that were written in Latin, in Middle English, in French. Sometimes I struggle through texts in other languages as well, other Romance languages, but my core competencies, I guess, could fit in a French department, do just fine in this English and comparative literature department. And Marie de France is one of those texts, right? This is one of those texts written in French, but in England. Why is she called Marie from France? Well, probably because she had left France, maybe meaning the Ile-de-France, the Parisian region, for England at some previous time, because it would be completely bizarre for me to declare myself to be Hannah from New York when I'm in New York. It's very much like somewhere that you are not any longer identifying yourself as that place.
Mm-hmm. And she does identify herself, right, within the text. And that's one of the reasons that we actually know kind of who the author, was.
Yeah. So she says Marie in the Lays and Je suis Marie suis de France in a different one of her works. I think it's in the Fables.
Yeah.
But there are enough stylistic similarities that 3 different works are securely attributed to this one single Marie, even though Marie is basically the most common female name you can imagine at that time. So
yes, a woman named Mary in the Middle Ages. Imagine that.
Believe it.
So
yeah.
Believe it. It did happen. Yeah. So we're here, bold truth tellers here. But I hadn't thought about that, about the naming constraint, like about Hannah from New York, because oftentimes the way that medieval authors are often named, or medieval figures for that name, like oftentimes they are named by other people kind of looking backwards kind of onto them, or unless they signal themselves as having that location kind of appellation or something like that.
And oftentimes I'm thinking of like Ivo of Chartres, that's because he was the bishop of Chartres, or Bautry de Bourgogne, or Baldric of Bourgogne, or Dol, it's the same guy.
Yeah.
And it's because he had ecclesiastical appointments in these 2 different places. Anyway, France is a bigger territory. So to have a whole territory, but it's often more specific, it's kind of my point. And having that loconym that's quite a bit broader kind of suggests us move away from that region.
And like you were saying, kind of important to remember, right, is that people moved throughout the Middle Ages, and especially in the period that Maria is writing, right, if she was at kind of the court of Henry II of England, he's married to Eleanor of Aquitaine at that time, and the vast majority of his territory, the wealth of his kingdom actually exists kind of across the channel, in the place that we now call France, but other people would have called, Burgundy, or much more regionally there. So the idea that somebody from France would come to this guy's court was not at all a wild thought in any way, shape, or form. But 2, that shows kind of, as you were saying too, I think the importance of this kind of, I think, interdisciplinarity, but at least kind of, like you were saying, I think what you said was kind of a comparativist approach, thinking kind of across these traditional national historiographies and disciplinary boundaries, which were, of course, largely created in the 19th century and don't necessarily need to apply to the work that we do kind of in the Middle Ages, is that you pursue a question, you pursue kind of a set of texts, and you find out where they take you, and you got to do the work. I have, as you were kind of hinting at, sat down with a language I am not particularly familiar with, but with a dictionary, and spent hours and hours and hours just trying to puzzle out kind of what this thing, just in order to have kind of a question happen. And that's just kind of the way the work works sometimes.
Right. And indeed, as someone who was, for all that I'm arguing for my position in an English department and think it's completely legitimate at the same time, having been trained in a French department means that I came to this job not really able to puzzle through Old English, right? That wasn't part of my training. And now that I'm in an English department, I've taken it upon myself to at least acquire sort of a beginner level competency that with a dictionary I can succeed.
Yeah.
Right? If I'm slow and careful, as opposed to being totally at sea.
Yeah.
But it is funny, the sorts of pressures that end up on you throughout a career. And no one has pressured me. It's just I feel if I'm going to be a professor in an English department who specializes in medieval literature, then I ought to have a clue about Old English. If I'd ended up in a French department, I might not have ever felt that way.
That's the thing, right? Is it's not just being a professor, but the things that we do with our students oftentimes is you learn how to learn things.
Yeah.
And that could be a language or kind of a topic of study or something like that. And I mean, one of the things that, I think you and I have kind of talked about offline is, our interest in the way that the Middle Ages has been remembered in the contemporary world, right? What we call medievalism.
Yeah.
Which certainly we've talked about in this podcast, and talk about a little bit more in just a second. But like, I know a lot more about certain aspects of American history in a deeper, richer way than just kind of being an American who kind of knows something about the past.
Yeah.
Because that I want to know like why specific things about the Middle Ages were understood in the way they were in the area of, in the period, for example, of the American Civil War or in the period of Reconstruction.
Right.
Like I had to learn a lot about Reconstruction or the American Civil War in order to kind of understand those things. 19th century spirituality in America, wild.
Yeah.
Just absolutely wild.
Yeah. Something I still know nothing about. But indeed, I feel like allowing yourself to go down the rabbit holes is the great pleasure of this profession.
And a value too, right, is like just figuring out how to, like, you have a question, how do you answer it? Instead of taking kind of a shortcut.
It's like, what sorts of evidence would I even need to gather in order to, it's almost like the pre-work. What do I need to amass before I can actually do the work? And I've actually, along the way, I'm sure this is true of you too and of many of our listeners, I've had ideas for projects that I think are completely like intellectually viable, but that the pre-work is so onerous and like close to logistically impossible, especially in the American system, to bring up the American medieval. Like in Europe, there are a lot of these like big collaborative projects that happen, and you have a team of researchers tackling one particularly complex topic. It's like if I had a team or if I was working together with some folks, this could be possible, but just me, like one woman alone in my office, it's not gonna happen. Like I can never collate all of these untranscribed manuscripts to like figure out what the valence of the Latin language is in this particular obscure tradition. It's just not gonna happen.
Yeah. I remember reading about, I mean, one of the things, like when I was doing some historiographical work on a project, a piece that I published a little while ago, it was about kind of 19th century early medievalists within the American Academy. And like those dudes just had like hirelings that they would send to Europe for months or years, like, and they would just like, all right, go to that archive, see what you find. This is what you're looking for. And that guy would just work for 40 hours, 60 hours a week in that archive and then send all the research back to the professor who had published the article. Like, we don't have those resources here anymore.
No.
So it makes a big deal of difference. But there are opportunities for collaboration sometimes. I say that as a kind of a co-author. And, you know, even just like conversations like this, not as formal as on a podcast or anything like that. But Hannah and I were at a symposium recently together, and just like the conversations that kind of engender from there can spark collaborations or, you know, further questions. Maybe not to the extent, kind of like you were saying, Hannah, about these huge European-wide research grants, which involve millions of dollars and, you know, 10 to 15 researchers.
A bunch of
postdocs, exactly, who are kind of working on projects. Yeah. Sometimes they are treated exactly like that in the European system. Good thing this is American medieval and nobody in Europe will listen to this podcast. but yeah, that's what it is. But anyway, so going back to, I want to transition us, you know, more to kind of stuff that you're kind of interested in working on, because, you know, I brought up medievalism, and that seems to be kind of an interest of yours as well. And, you know, when we were talking about kind of what you wanted to talk about, you brought up opera, which is not a thing I have to say I know a whole lot about at all. Other than like, I'm picturing like kind of Wagner. That's the thing that immediately kind of comes to mind with the Nibelungenlied and stuff like that.
As well you might.
But medievalism opera, what are we talking about? Like, is this a new thing? Is it an older thing? Is it something that's coming back? Or is it just kind of floats there?
Yeah. So I have been teaching this course this term, co-teaching, very importantly, co-teaching a course this term.
Talk about collaboration.
Yes, with a historian of opera, Julia Doe, my colleague here at Columbia, I have learned so much about teaching from her, and I've learned so much about opera from her, because I like opera, but in a sort of like dilettantish way. But Julia and I are just, again, we're friends. We are former neighbors, and we would constantly sort of bring up how there's this strange intersection between our two fields, which one would think kind of have nothing to do with each other. Like, and yet there's this persistent medievalism in opera that maybe the first famous instantiations are not only Wagner, although he really stands in for a lot, but also his contemporaries, like Il Trovatore by Verdi is not based on a medieval text, but it's inspired by the figure of the troubadour, right?
Okay.
And Wagner, he apparently in his life, I learned a lot about Wagner, like somewhat against my will.
Fair enough,
But now I feel like I've learned, but he apparently had a whole medieval library, like in Middle High German, and would like read through these texts and was like, very philologically invested in them. It was by no means something that he like had third hand. He was like digging through like Gottfried von Strasberg and, Eschenbach and whatever to get his sources for his different operas. And yet he's also basically doing a sort of mashup with some of his other obsessions. So like the one that we brought in our class was Tristan and Isolde, because there was a revival this year at the Met, a new production by Yuval Sharon, which I would be happy to talk about because it's very interesting. But so we did that one because it was on at the Met and we could take our students to go see it. One of the great advantages of being in New York. But it's basically like the improbable mashup of Gottfried von Strasberg's Tristan and Schopenhauer. So, because he was absolutely, Wagner, I learned, which is probably well known to some of your listeners, but was news to me, absolutely obsessed with Schopenhauer to the extent that his wife, Cosima Wagner, kept a diary over like the decades that they were together. And in her diary, she'll jot down like what they did of an evening. And there are 200 plus mentions of Schopenhauer in this diary. And it's always something like, read Schopenhauer tonight. Like it's just like it's just like such a quotidian thing where it's like, what did you do? We read Schopenhauer. Anyway, he was obsessed with particularly the idea that Schopenhauer thought music was the highest art because basically, like humans, music embodies the metaphysical will.
Okay.
So like humans equal music, kind of. And then harmonic suspension is, in scholar Brian McGee's words, quote, analogous to the satisfaction of the will, which is enhanced through delay. So if you want something and you have to wait for it, you're going to love it that much more when you get it. And that sort of idea that like, if you are forced to wait for something before it happens, it's all the sweeter, is basically the entire idea behind the opera Tristan and Isolde.
Yes.
And so he borrowed the plot points from Gottfried, but like very improbable plot points. Like he ignored a lot of what, if you just read Gottfried in isolation, is interesting about Gottfried. He kind of like did away with much of the texture of the medieval text in favor of choosing 3 critical moments that just build suspense. And then he also, not only plot-wise, but music-wise, famously starts the opera with this Tristan chord that's not going to be resolved until 4.5 hours later when the opera ends. So the whole time you're listening for harmonic resolution. And I'm someone who's not like, I don't know much about music theory. I don't know much about opera. But even as like a dilettante, as I self-identify, you are just like waiting because he keeps like quoting himself. Obviously, he's famous for his leitmotifs. And he keeps like bringing it back, lest you forget this chord is still not resolved. There are all these situations, and it's not until Isolde's famous Liebestod at the end that the chord finally comes to a resolution, which I have learned is not a full resolution, but a plagal resolution. Listen to me. Don't I sound like I know what I'm talking about?
I am utterly enthralled and impressed. So, yes. I want to go back just briefly.
TMI about Wagner?
No. Well, to Cosima Wagner's diaries, in which she has 200 entries about Schopenhauer, in which, if some of them are indeed, and I haven't looked at the diary, so I'm relying on you here. It's like, read Schopenhauer again. It's just like, I can hear her tone of voice when she's writing that, which is just, to me, it's just like, Jesus Christ, like, again.
I mean, my impression is that she was very devoted, a very devoted wife, and like not likely to have the tone that I would have if I were forced to read Schopenhauer again. I could be wrong.
Hi, friends. Let me take a minute here and tell you about a podcast friend of American Medieval, That Aged Well. This is a podcast about revisiting 80s and 90s movies and TV, but, like today doing that. Comedians and pop culture superfans Paul and Erica walk you through some of all of our faves. Recently, for example, Kevin Smith's Dogma, a great thoughtful look at Catholicism via 2 very pissed-off slacker angels, and the Keanu flick, The Devil's Advocate, which is, well, a film. Anyway, their commentary and thoughtful reflection sneaks up on you, right between the laughs. It's fun, kind of like you were at a friend's house, but for a sleepover where everyone was a nerd, but, in a good way. So please go check out the pod That Aged Well. Find it everywhere you can find any podcasts. Spirits is a history and comedy podcast focused on folklore, mythology, and the occult. Told through the lens of feminism, queerness, and modern adulthood, Julie and Amanda get together every week to learn more about a different story from mythology and folklore over drinks. Get it? Spirits. That's everything from the mythological origins of major franchises like Lord of the Rings, Wonder Woman, to modern urban legends, to a roundup of werewolf stories. They've been doing this for 9 years and are still going strong. Head to spiritspodcast.com or search for Spirits wherever you download your podcasts. New episodes every Wednesday.
Wagner's obviously a hugely problematic figure that also was a great way into thinking about the ways that medievalism can be pernicious.
Yeah.
Because he animated the Middle Ages as this like nationalist fantasy of like a pure white German Jew-free past. And so like he was using it less so, and Tristan's just a less political opera than some of his others. But regardless, like that's a huge part. He wrote like absolutely abhorrent things. And it is a difficult figure because he's indisputably hugely important in the history of music. And he's also, like, as a person, awful. So it's just like, what do you do with these sorts of difficult figures? It's a question that obviously is like live right now about Michael Jackson with that new documentary coming out.
Absolutely, yeah.
But regardless, the thing that we wanted to do was basically look at what do you do when you perform Wagner in 2026? And are you picking up on the parts of the work that are more medieval adjacent?
Yeah.
Are you emphasizing the Schopenhauer? Are you just saying like, whatever, this is actually going to be on like a warship, which is what the 2016 Met production did. And it was basically sort of set in World War I, vaguely.
Okay.
And also the Met hired an Israeli-American director to do it, Yuval Sharon, who's one of the biggest names in most, and certainly some of the splashiest opera productions of the last decade have been by him. So it's also like, what does it mean to be of Jewish descent and staging a Wagner opera? Like, what do you do with that? And the production, like, you can read a lot of reviews of it in the Times. It was a huge event here in New York, genuinely. Like, it wasn't just because I was teaching an opera class. Like, just people were talking about it. It was really in the air. But one of the things that's kind of the point of Wagner's, like, his thesis, his Schopenhauerian thesis, basically, is like, okay, the will is going to be all the stronger if we make it delay. But what it's willing towards is getting past the phenomenal and into the noumenal, right? Like leaving behind the differentiated world and transcending into undifferentiated spirit, like, because that's the realm where there's truth. Okay. And the way the opera stages this is that there's a passage from life to death. And death is where you're like in this noumenal state. But weirdly, Sharon's production at the end, where we're supposed to like finally get there, like it's the Liebestod, like finally the chord's going to resolve. Finally, like everyone dies, like, which weirdly is the hoped for ending given this framework. Instead, they had Isolde sing to a plastic baby. I mean, obviously it was meant to be a real baby, whatever, but it was like this sort of like, if I can be frank, like cheesy doll. And instead of being like, I am now transcending, she was basically like, I am passing something on to someone who's definitely still going to remain in the world, which seems to me to be like the opposite of Wagner's thesis. So that was an interesting staging choice that our class got a lot of juice out of.
Yeah. This discussion, like, it has me thinking a lot about, like, just some of the points that you brought up, the politics of art, the politics of the artist, versus the politics of the art, but then the politics of the production, right? Like, as you were saying, like, what does it mean to stage Wagner, who, during his lifetime, a notorious anti-Semite with lots of really problematic things, also, remembered very fondly during the Third Reich. And then to do that in New York City with an Israeli director, then, how does that kind of work? But then, within that too, is that Wagner, this is what you mentioned kind of at the beginning, is that the opera Tristan and Isolde is not the same as the medieval story that it is telling.
No.
It is doing something different there. And that's something that I think is oftentimes overlooked when people talk about manifestations of the Middle Ages kind of in cultural production, kind of largely, right? This thing about medieval is that it's always a product of the time and the place in which it was created. But here you have several acts of creation, right? Because you have, the original opera, you have, the earlier productions in which this one is clearly playing on, and then this production as well. And so how would you, like, with your students, like imagine, me being a student because, I don't know anything. So I'm probably no less than any normal student at Columbia right now. Like, how would you walk a student through those kind of choices or get them to think about this thing, not just as kind of a thing that you sit through and you enjoy and you listen to musically, but like there's all this other stuff kind of going on kind of in the background?
That's a great question. That's really been, to be honest, the reason that we wanted to put on this course is that I am answering your question, I swear. Give me a second. But Wagner is kind of, like you said, if someone says medievalism and opera, people think of Wagner. If they can think of anything, they think of Wagner, right? And that's legitimate. But also, there's been this huge uptick in medievalist operas in the last 30 years. There have been something like 100 new medievalist operas in the last 30 years. It is astonishing. And of course, most of those are like performed once in like some weird chamber setting and never performed again. But regardless, there's this like huge flourishing.
Yeah.
So I'm obliquely circling back to your question of like, we're clearly in a moment, a kind of long moment, but a moment when turning to the Middle Ages is feeling fruitful for composers of opera. The 19th century is another such moment. Right?
Yeah.
And in between, it's not that it completely bottoms out. There are figures like Benjamin Britten, who's also trying to do something with the medieval in between, but there's sort of a lull. And so that answer, or like an attempt to answer, how can we disentangle all of these different layers? Or if this is like, we could think of it as sediments, right? And getting back to a different geological substrate. And basically what we've learned in this class is that like the method we've taken is kind of to take each part separately and then have a synthetic discussion. So we started by just reading Gottfried. We didn't talk yet about Wagner.
Okay.
Then we started to talk about Wagner by looking at videoed productions that were available on the Met's website and on other opera streaming platforms. And then we went and saw the Yuval Sharon production and were able to put it in conversation with these other versions and choices. And that's still by no means an exhaustive way of doing it. But if you look at photographs from very early stagings of Tristan, everyone's dressed like it's the Renaissance fair. It's just like pure, like, and they're like on this, like, it honestly looks kind of like a pre-Raphaelite painting. I know that's like from a different country, but like that's the vibe. It's like very like romanticized medievalism. And in Sharon's production, the only nod to the medieval was the costuming. So again, they're dressed like they're in a Ren fair, or maybe like Shrek, like Fiona. Like honestly, this was said in the Times. This is not my thought. Okay, I'm like borrowing something that was published. But everything else about it almost feels like a spaceship. It's like hyper modern, hyper like technological.
Really? Okay.
And so it's like, why are we leaving this sort of like little grain of like winking medievalism that you and I might know is not, in fact, like it's more like pseudo medieval Ren fair vibes, but like that's supposed to, I think, evoke for people the medieval. Why are we like leaving that frisson of the medieval in the center of what is otherwise like almost like TikTok writ large, like tons of different changing videos, like strange shapes that appear and disappear, body doubles, like just like a sort of frantic, like attention economy, like maelstrom. And to be honest, that's a question that we saw it in early March, and I'm still not totally sure. Is it just sort of like a wink at the fact that Wagner was drawing on something medieval? I'm not actually sure how deep it is. But yeah, anyway, a strategy is just to sort of construct all the layers and give each of them a time to air and breathe and give students a chance to come to terms with them before we add another element.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I hadn't kind of thought about it that way. But it, in my own pedagogy, is just breaking things down to their constituent parts. And oftentimes, I have to say I fail at that, when I'm trying to convey kind of complex things, because, and this goes back to another thing that you were talking about, kind of about research projects, is about the level of pre-work that you often need to do in order to understand a question, let alone the answer to that question, can be really staggering sometimes, because, it's not just that, Sharon is pulling on Wagner kind of, carte blanche straight from the 19th century. It's all these other productions of Tristan. It's all of Sharon's other productions of other operas, right, that he's kind of drawing on.
Indeed.
As well as, the inherent medievalism of the tale itself, which exists, within the opera, but also kind of in a larger kind of cultural space in which people no, not everybody, but many people kind of know the story of Tristan and Isolde, like this kind of quote unquote tragic love story about, star-crossed lovers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And that's really hard to understand, right? To disentangle those things. And sometimes threads that don't want to be or aren't meant to be disentangled too, right? In the kind of current instantiation, the current instance of this production.
Right. Yeah, I think that's just right. And the other thing that didn't even enter our conversation yet, but which is a huge part of the coverage of this production, is the music. Like, it's, obviously, needless to say,
there is music in opera.
Wagner's score, but it's like especially the soprano, Lisa Davidson, is considered widely to be the greatest living Wagnerian soprano. And so this is her debut in this role. Technically, she like pre-debuted it in Spain somewhere, but this was her like big opera house debut of this role. And that's just also like, so there's also like, how is she in conversation with previous soprano? Like there's just to say that the network is even more vast, and depending on where you're coming from, different parts of it will interest you more or less.
Yeah, no, I think this is really great. So can we go back for a moment, though? Just leaving Tristan Wagner and Tristan and Isolde to the side for a second.
Please.
Yeah, please, yes.
Enough.
I'm fascinated by this resurgence of medievalist operas now.
Yes.
So you said more than 100 over the last short period of time. Is that correct?
Yeah. So there's a 2024 dissertation that enumerates and specifically says that he doesn't think he got them all, enumerates 94. And I am personally aware of some in New York that have like premiered in the last few months that are not on his list, right? So I'm assuming that the real number is more like 100-ish, just because I, who do not pay the closest attention, am already aware of other ones that he doesn't list. This is George Haggett in a 2024 Oxford dissertation. And what's especially astonishing is that it's very hard for an opera to become canonical. This is news to me, but it's true. Okay, so it's like hard for something, and by canonical, I just mean re-performed, like often-ish. That it's like in the repertoire that opera houses consider putting on. And it's rare, especially for like newer operas, to attain that status.
Sure.
And yet 2 of the operas of this millennium, probably the 2 that would be cited as those that have like entered the canon somewhat definitively, are both about troubadours and drawing on medieval sources. So this is Kaya Sariaho's L'Amour de Loin, which premiered in 2000. And George Benjamin's Written on Skin, which premiered in 2012. And so they're both from this millennium. They're both drawing on troubadour stories. They're very different, like soundscapes musically.
Sure.
But they're much more engaged with the Middle Ages than the like Ren Fair Wagner that I was just mentioning. So like I brought, if it's okay, I brought the libretto of Benjamin's Written on Skin. And I actually wondered if I could just read the first. I'm not going to do the different parts because that would be completely bizarre. But the libretto was written by a really remarkable writer called Martin Crimp. And I think his sort of staging of medievalism in this opening scene and like just the way he's thinking about the Middle Ages is really provocative. So I thought I would bring it to you.
Please, yes.
This is sung by various angels. And again, I'm not going to differentiate among the parts, but there are 3 angels on stage talking to each other. And here's what they say. Strip the cities of brick, dismantle them, strip out the wires and cover the land with grass. Force chrome and aluminum. Of course, it says aluminium. That tripped me up. Sorry. Force chrome and aluminum back into the earth. Cancel all flights from the international airport and people the sky with angels. Erase the Saturday car park from the marketplace. Rub out the white lines. Shatter the printing press. Make each new book a precious object written on skin. Make way for the wild primrose and slow torture of criminals. Fade out the living. Snap the dead back to life.
Wow.
So there's this like really astonishing idea that the Middle Ages is just like below the parking lot, which is also very Richard III. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're not wrong, I guess.
No. I mean, like if you are in England or in Europe for most of, it is literally just kind of below your feet at the same time.
Yeah.
But also the idea too is that going back to our time machine, right? Like is the angels are conducting that, like kind of rewinding time, right? But how near it is. right? It's just like, if we just take away these things, which can be encompassed within a few lines, like, bam, there we are back in the medieval.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that it's just a matter of like getting rid of some trappings.
Mm-hmm.
And if we just can dispense with those, we'll be there.
Yeah.
And we'll be in the right framework. I like the wild primrose and slow torture of criminals. This sort of like romantic, grotesque dichotomy that David Matthews, for instance, developed in his work about like what is medievalism. But it is this sort of like, they have to both be there, both lovely nature and also like horrific violence. Like that's the Middle Ages, right? Which I know this is also like a stereotype that you've done some dismantling of in your own work, but it's just like, it's evocative not only of like a sense of where the past is, but also of like the inherited stereotypes that are available about what the Middle Ages was.
But in some sense too, and I have to say, like, I know as much of this opera as you have told me right here. So, but it seems to suggest too, like, a desirable past, right?
Yes.
In some way. And just because, some of the ways that the medieval is being remembered in this decade of the 21st century, like kind of after the pandemic, like, it resonates a little bit more with that. And so I'm actually kind of surprised that it's from earlier in the period. And I don't really know what to do with that kind of thought, except to, as we were talking about, I'm going to Google some stuff and do some research after this on this opera to find out kind of more about the writer and the production as well.
Yeah.
So
there's like a great New Yorker profile of Benjamin, and it talks about his collaboration with Crimp. I want to say it's written by Rebecca Mead, so I definitely recommend that. I think I might have sent it to you, but if I didn't, I can. And then the opera itself can be seen on Medici.tv, which if you're an academic, your institution may subscribe. It's an opera streaming platform. But what's so interesting about the way it was staged is that, like, how to even explain it? It's like there's a frame of rooms that can be gone into, and then there's sort of like a room that is bigger, that takes up more of the stage, that is the Middle Ages. And the surrounding rooms look like a conservation lab.
Oh, really?
And so it's like white coats, suits, like from right here, right now.
Yeah.
People doing conservation work on manuscripts. You see like manuscript pages in that lab. And then like some of those workers enter the plot as medieval people having redressed themselves like on stage into sort of like medieval quote unquote garb, which in this case is like perhaps more accurate in terms of its cut, but everything is very dirty, even though they're going to a noble's house. And the opera Written on Skin, it's about the eaten heart motif that shows up in troubadour poetry and boccaccio, but it's like a woman is caught with her lover and unwittingly served his heart for dinner. And then she is like, this was the best thing I've ever eaten. I'll never eat anything else, and throws herself out a window. Yeah. Very operatic, really. So
very dramatic. The way you're describing the staging, and again, I'll have to go kind of take a look, but it reminds me kind of a dollhouse.
Yeah.
But also the idea that the medieval is, again, like we were just talking about, right, that it's just below the surface, that, you move very easily between kind of modern and medieval, which is really kind of a staple in some ways of, you mentioned David Matthews' book, Medievalism, which is kind of a staple of the study of this topic, in which he suggests something similar too, right, in that 19th century, especially 19th and early 20th century peoples, that if you moved in space, you could kind of effectively move in time too. And it was a colonialist discourse oftentimes, right? But it's easy enough to translate that and kind of play with that within a different type of, in this case, opera or something.
Yeah. I have to say, though, it's been like, if you are a medievalist listener and you haven't investigated medievalist opera, it's been so fascinating. And it's just, I feel like there's just thing after thing. This Sarajevo opera, like, it's just astonishing and easily found. The last one that we study in the class, and I'll just say this really briefly, was written in 2023 here at Columbia. Premiered here at Miller Theater. It's an opera by the composer Kate Soper, and it's called The Hunt. And it's based on the unicorn tapestries that are in Cluny and in the cloisters, plus like a hodgepodge. Like there's Hildegard von Bingen, but not like her music or her mysticism. No, her like description of what unicorn horn can do for you from the Physica. And like there's Isidore talking about Isidore of Seville. The riddles from the Exeter book. There's a troubadour song. And so it's this sort of like strange puzzle. And the tone of the opera is like pop music adjacent. Like it's not as arty, shall we say, or like snooty, maybe. Benjamin's opera is very difficult music. Like if you're not a real music person, not a real opera person, it's like tough sledding.
Yeah.
But Soper is very accessible. And so it's like, we're actually talking about that today in class. So I don't actually have conclusions to report, but it's been very provocative to think about.
That sounds absolutely amazing, and in some ways a testament to the many ways, like medievalism and opera, like, when we were emailing back and forth about kind of this, and you suggested this, I was like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. I don't know anything, but like, I'm sure there's stuff we can talk about. And now I'm going to spend the next 2 hours, like, seeing if we have a subscription to Medici.tv and like trying to figure out this by Soper, you said, the most recent operas.
I can send you my syllabus, or I should say our syllabus, and that could give you a lot of links. I'll save you some time.
That would be wonderful. But I'm sure for our listeners too, who won't have the benefit of your syllabus out there, is thinking about the different ways that the medieval just seems to intrude into all these different types of cultural production, and how rich and rewarding examining them can be, even as they are difficult oftentimes to untangle, be it Tristan and Isolde or, these newer operas. And again, appearing in places that even a lot of people, aren't necessarily looking. Nobody here puts any stock in what Timothée Chalamet said about ballet and opera, but I feel like I had to throw that in just to show that I'm topical. But but there are all sorts of really interesting things with the Middle Ages kind of going on out there.
Yeah.
All right, we are unfortunately on that note out of time. So this is
too much about Wagner. I'm sorry.
Too much about Wagner. Yeah. So we'll have you back on maybe to talk about some,
about something that's not Wagner.
Recatalogued all those, just in the 21st century medievalist operas. So because that's crazy. There's something weird going on there. And
there's something in the water.
There's something in the water, absolutely. So a return to the Middle Ages. So I have said repeatedly on social media is stop making medievalists relevant. I will tolerate kind of artistic production. This is great. I love to talk about this. If we could get it out of the politics a little bit more, at least the specific, more violent evocations. But anyway, all right. I'm babbling now, which tells me I should probably log off. But I mean, it's my podcast. I can do whatever I want. Anyway, Hannah, thank you so much for joining us. If our listeners out there want to know more about kind of you, your work, kind of stuff that you're interested in, and they have this thing called the internet, where might they find you on the internet?
Man, good luck, listeners. I don't believe in any of it. Okay. You can find my faculty profile. No, okay. While I don't use social media, I am a co-host of that other podcast. So if you liked having my voice in your ears, you can go check out Proust Curious. I'm on there with Emma Clausen.
Okay, fantastic. Proust Curious. It is, again, a name I've never mispronounced in my entire life. So
who would?
All right. Who would? Not even a person. So anyway, all right, Hannah, thank you so much again for joining us.
Pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, too, for listening to American Medieval. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please make sure to visit our Patreon and check out Hannah's work and go look up Medievalism and Opera because, man, that sounds really cool. All right. See you guys next week. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, a proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.